Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. As I just said to Tijan, we're going to keep the microphones muted for you all until individuals are ready to speak. And we have a bit of a long program today. It's going to be in two parts. The first part will be speakers who contributed to a booklet that my friend and colleague Tijan will talk about. And the second part will be for those of us who showed up to speak a little bit about Chuck's influence and generosity as it reflected on our own lives. But first, I'd like to welcome you all to this event, honoring the life and celebrating the life of our dear friend, Charles R. Larson, known to most of us as Chuck, and just to welcome you here today in his memory. Chuck was our colleague for 40 years here at American University. He's the husband of Roberta, who will speak later today, and of course, the father to Vanessa and Josh, who are present today as well. And as I sit here introducing the program, I'm also admitting folks into the room. We have so many people who have come to join us from all around the world. So the event is going to be recorded, and I just want everyone to be aware of that before you speak. Roberta wanted a memory of it, and so it is recorded, and it will work as I explained. The first half will feature contributors to the booklet, which is right here in my hands. Beautiful remembering Charles R. Larson, and then down here it says Bridge Builder Without Borders. And Tijan Sallah will speak a little bit about putting that booklet together. This is really his baby, and it's such a beautiful piece of work. So more about that in a moment. I also want to say that if anybody would like a copy of this booklet, in the chat, Roberta has included her home address. So what we would need you to do is to send her a prepaid flat rate priority mail envelope with your address on it, and she'll drop one of those booklets in the mail and send it back to you. And it features some amazing writers, including Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka. Okay, well, that said, let's get this underway. My name is David Keplinger. Chuck's friend and colleague. Chuck hired me here at American University. I would not be sitting here if it weren't for this man, my beautiful friend. So I'm very happy to serve as moderator today. For those who among the contributors are going to speak, please keep your comments to 3 to 5 minutes if you could, because we have a lot to get through. And then those of you among Chuck's friends and colleagues here at AU who are tuning in, also keep your comments to 3 to 5 minutes. I know that's difficult to do, but we do want a cohesive video for the remembrance. And if we go on too long, it'll be hours. So I'd like to begin with Tijan Sallah, who I spoke a little bit about. Tijan is a Gambian poet and also a very good friend of Chuck's.
Thank you, David, and all attendees and Roberta and the family. I'm delighted to be part of this gathering in honor of the memory of our friend, Professor Charles Raymond Larson, whom we fondly call Chuck. I have known Chuck for over 30 years. When Roberta informed me of Chuck's passing, I felt truly sad. I volunteered that perhaps the best way to celebrate his life was to get testimonials from people who knew him. We have now compiled these in a booklet. I wish to thank those who contributed. Our own Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, Hanan Al-Sheikh, Mancha Jawara, Ernest Emenyonu, James Gibbs, Marita Golden, Helon Habila, David Keplinger, Bernd Linsford, Ethelbert Miller, Mina Nayak, Okay Ndibe, Veronique Tajo, Henry Taylor, and myself. I'm sorry if there are some in this gathering who wanted to contribute, but whom we may have missed. We received almost near unanimous positive responses from those we contacted. And I think that shows the goodwill people had for Chuck. To me, Chuck was simply an extraordinary person who insisted on being ordinary. He was a highly productive literary scholar, an exciting teacher, and a generous spirit. I was not one of his students, but I have seen him give some of the most engaging lectures on African literature at American University. I wanted to make brief remarks on how I came to know Chuck and the collaborations we have had over the years. Let me start with just a few facts. I wanted to talk briefly about Chuck's Peace Corps years. In 1962, Chuck was among the first batch of Peace Corps volunteers assigned to Nigeria. He spent 2 years from 1962 to 64 in Anambra State, Eastern Nigeria, teaching English at the Anglican Grammar School, Oroku Grammar School. There, he introduced baseball to the school. He started the school's first drama society, getting kids doing plays. He also acquired valuable books from American publishers to stock the school's library and initiated the systematic cataloging of the books. By the end of his tenure, the founding principal of the school, Mr. Hezekiah Chiwuzi, noted he practically built the school's library and was very popular among the students. Now, I don't know how many of us in this audience can claim to have had this remarkable achievement on young lives. I think it was Chuck's Peace Corps experience which began his love fest with Africa and African literature. While in Nigeria, he discovered some of the popular literature at the time, Onitsha, market literature, and few of the emerging novelists. This set him on the path to do a PhD in comparative literature at Indiana University. Now, how did I come to know Chuck? In 1980, while completing my undergraduate at Berea College in Kentucky, I published my first book of poems, When Africa Was a Young Woman. I wanted a knowledgeable reviewer. It turned out Nuruddin Farah, the Somali novelist, was visiting his friend, Professor Said Samatar, at Eastern Kentucky University, and without hesitation, he said, send it to Professor Larson. Larson, at the time, was a literary kingmaker of sorts. I sent the book to him, but never heard from him. In '81, I attended the African Literature Association conference, which was held at the Claremont colleges. I think there are some in the audience who were there, Professor Linford and others. It was one of the best attended by writers. Mongo Betty, Florent Nwapa, Lenry Peters, Mazizi Kunene, George Lamin, Paula Marshall, and Maurice Konde. Two things stood out for me at that ALA conference. One was Maurice Konde kept telling me, since I was one of the youngest participants, mon petit frère, my little brother, my little brother. The other thing that stood out was Dennis Brutus, the South African poet and activist, came to me and said, have you seen the latest world literature today? I said, no. He said, it is devoted to Chinese and African letters. And Charles Larson has a review of your book in it. On that same issue, there was an article on Dennis Brutus' own work. I rushed to get a copy at the book display room and was thrilled by Larson's review. I searched around for his more extended essays and then bought The Emergence of African Fiction at that conference. Later, when I read this book, I was amazed by the ambition of the book and its diversity. I learned later that it was Chuck's doctoral dissertation at Indiana University and one of the very first books of literary criticism of African literature in the American Academy. It was, in short, a foundational text. The book covered the fiction of many of the major writers at the time, who wrote before 1970, from Amos Tutuola to Onitsha market literature to works by negritude fiction writers like Kamara Lai. The book, however, was not without its critics. Chinua Achebe criticized it for Larson's concerns with universalism, that he was conflating Western literary standards with universalism. But one of the more ferocious attacks was by Ayi Kwe-ama, who wrote an essay in which, because he was unhappy that Larson missed facts about his life and work, he concluded Larson's brand of criticism should be called larceny, fiction criticizing fiction. However, despite all these debates about Larson's book, many who read the book appreciated Larson as an intellectual heavyweight. And so respect for him among the fair-minded was generally high. Now, at this period, I have not known Charles. It was in 1989, when I moved to the Washington, D.C. area to work for the World Bank, that I got to know Charles and Chuck Larson more in person. And over the years, we collaborated on many literary projects. When he edited his classic major anthology on the African skies of short stories, he included one of my short stories. And he asked that I join him with the South African writer, Sindiwe Magona, in an interview with Scott Simon on Weekend Edition at NPR. Later, when he published The Ordeal of the African Writer, looking at the difficulties African writers were facing, he asked me to review the entire manuscript and write a blog for the book. Now, I wanted to talk about just two more things and I'll end. One was Achebe's 70th birthday, in which Chinua Achebe invited both me and Larson to attend. Before we went for that conference, Larson called me and said we should plan to write together to attend the event. A month before the event, I left for a World Bank mission to Yemen. Unfortunately, during a layover in London, I was hit by a car, suffered a femur fracture, and spent 1 month recovering at the Clementine Churchill Hospital. I returned to the US in a wheelchair. My wife, who at that time was starting her engineering career, had to balance 2 little kids, and then now with a new, big, helpless adult, a big baby. Now, a week later, when I returned to the US, Chuck called me and came for a visit and brought me copies of the Achebe birthday events, which I missed, and really to cheer me up. It was in such low moments that you know people, and Chuck is truly special in my book. He was somebody who cared. The last thing that I'll mention about Chuck was in 2008. The Washington Post and Penn Faulkner hosted the 50th anniversary of Things Fall Apart. Chuck and I were asked to introduce Achebe. Even before Chinua Achebe spoke, he highlighted Chuck's presence in the audience, and the audience was packed. Achebe said, "You were one of my friends from the very beginning. You used to ride a bicycle in front of my father's house." Chuck was referring to the Peace Corps years in Eastern Nigeria. Achebe was referring to the Chuck's Peace Corps years in Nigeria. So even the father of the African novel recognized Chuck's importance. I could go on and on with several anecdotes, but I have to let others to speak so we can take the full true measure of this great man. The booklet we have assembled gives a fuller picture about him. And if you admire Larson, I urge you to get a copy. In conclusion, 3 things I want to mention about Chuck. Chuck, in my view, was a literary doctor without borders. He went into many areas that traditionally people don't go into. He wrote a book on American Indian fiction, on the novel in the Third World, and the emergence of African fiction. Chuck also was a venture literary critic. In economics, we talk about venture capitalists, entrepreneurs who break into new areas and start new business. They take high risk and reap high returns. Chuck was like that with African and non-Western literatures. He took risks to review new work. He was not a traditionalist, focusing on dead Western writers. He wanted the literary tent to be bigger. To him, all people's stories mattered. Generous, caring, adventurous, Chuck was truly a remarkable human being. I already miss our friendship. I want to thank his wife, Roberta, and his children, Vanessa and Josh, for sharing him with us. May his soul rest in peace. I yield to David. Thank you, the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Tijan. Absolutely lovely. And thank you for those stories of how Chuck was acknowledged in ways that his colleagues here knew about but never witnessed. So it's wonderful to hear. The next person on my list is Ernest Emenyonu.
Should I go on?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, I want to add my sympathy, expression of sympathy and condolence to Roberta and kids, well, family of Charles. When Bentley first informed me that Charles had passed on, it was a terrible blow. The first thing I did was to go to my laptop to check the type of correspondence I've had with Chuck over the years. It started with his inviting me to contribute a story when he was preparing the manuscript, More African Short Stories, More African Stories. And he wanted a story on the war that had just ended in Nigeria, the Nigeria-Biafra War. That book was published, that collection was published in 1971. So that makes it 50 years this year that I have known Charles. And when I looked through my laptop, I saw that, in fact, I have the correspondence between us. It's enough to write. It's enough really to fill a book. Not, and it really talks about all kinds of things. We exchange ideas. There was a time I was in Washington, D.C., and he was on an official assignment. I went in and taught his African literature class at American University for 2 weeks. That's, but what I want to recall most here, since we're limited in time, Charles wasn't just a friend that we were here, relating with each other in the United States. He went to my village, my rural village in Nigeria. And I want to give you a piece of that experience to show you the sort of thing that happened. I said in May 2005, I persuaded Chuck to attend with me and a few other colleagues the renowned University of Calabar International Conference on African Literature and the English Language, held from its inception in 1981 in the first week of May every year. At that time, Tijan had mentioned it, Charles was understandably still apprehensive about African literature conferences, given the misconception and misinterpretation and the utmost ridicule that Aikwama had reduced his Charles's criticism of African literature to. Well, he went. It took some time to persuade him. Nevertheless, when he finally made up his mind to attend, he was resolute as ever. His letter to me on November 30, 2004 was direct. Ernest, thank you so much for the invitation to go to Calabar. I know you had much to do with it. And yes, I accept. I'm thrilled. I'm honored. I'm very pleased. Will you let the conveners know that I accept and that the title of my speech will be African Writers at Risk? This was a speech that touched practically all parts of Africa in terms of leadership and in terms of what the writers were doing that put them at risk. Facing a formidable congregation of towering political personages, assortment of literary scholars, creative writers, professors, and the general public, Charles challenged the Nigerian government in particular and African governments in general. Hear him. He said, and for the icing on the cake, to increase the awareness of African writers and African artists in general, what about naming streets and parks and buildings for African writers? What about postage stamps? What is to stop an enlightened African government, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Botswana, from honoring African artists, beginning with African writers? Hasn't the time arrived for Leopold Sedar Senghor, one of the fathers of negritude, to be honored as part of an African postage series celebrating African writers? Shouldn't Chief D.O. Fagunwa, Amos Tutuola, Ken Saro-Wiwa, Cyprian Ekwensi, and Christopher Kibo be printed on Nigerian postage stamps, and Bessie Head be honored on a postage stamp in Botswana? What better way to heal the wounds of the past? And no doubt, it's past time to instigate a little pride in what is, after all, the continent's most prized possession, its writers. When he finished, it was quite a long speech. When he finished, he received a standing ovation. The organizers of the conference presented him with a plaque depicting his excellence in the field of African literature. Personally, I do not know what led to what, but less than a year after Chuck's speech in Calabar, Nigeria released the first ever postage stamps bearing the faces of Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka, respectively. I sent a few as souvenir to Chuck. After the conference, Chuck traveled with me to my hometown in Biere in Imo State, a 3-hour drive from Calabar. He saw my country home in my village, Munjambiri. He saw my father's compound, still the home of all his late 8 wives and all their descendants, more than half a century after my father's death. He met my relatives, felt and touched my ancestral roots. We walked around, chatted, drank, and ate Nigerian food in my house. After that historic spontaneous visit, Charles became, in what we call in Igbo cultural parlance, we refer to as Nwanne the number, my beloved brother in distant land. Chuck did other things remarkable towards the enhancement of intellectual development of young Nigerians beyond the promotion of African literature. He played a significant role in the establishment of a major 21st century private university in Nigeria, modeled after American University, Washington, D.C. Charles was on the governing council at American University, which nurtured and facilitated the establishment of the new university in Nigeria named American University in Nigeria. On May 11, 2004, I received a letter from one of the people who had been invited in the United States for an interview for the chief executive of the university, what in Nigeria we call vice chancellor, here chancellor. And this fellow said to me, "Dear Dr. Mignogna, Dr. Charles Larson has recommended that I contact you to learn more about higher education in Nigeria. I'm being considered for a position with American University in Nigeria and wanted to know more about the situation in Nigeria for higher education at this time. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nigeria 1962 to 64 and have kept up with the general situation there, but not specifically in higher education. Would you be available to talk over the phone or direct me to some resources or people that I may use to be informed?" We talked long hours, a number of times, in depth, on the theme of higher education in 21st century Nigeria, challenges and dynamics for success. There were about 23 candidates, I understand, that were interviewed for the position. The candidate recommended by Charles got the job. In my tribute, I had covered a number of things, the reactions to his works, his tenacity of purpose, his friendliness, self-effacing personality. But when he says it, he means it. And so when, as I said, it was Bentley Linfors who notified me that our mutual friend, Charles, had passed on. I didn't think that was possible or that was true at the time, but eventually I accepted it. Chuck, until his death, remained my beloved brother in distant land, what in Igbo cultural situation we call one need in number. Once when he was, as I mentioned, on official retirement, and I happened to be in Washington, D.C., I taught his African literature class for 2 weeks. Our correspondence over the years, spanning 50 years, really, is a documentary of shared ideas and visions. Intriguing, remarkable, robust, much of it personal between the two of us, excelling our mutual compassion for each other. For the person of Charles, for me, it's a great loss, irreparable. What am I going to do with all of those things we started discussing? What am I going to do about all those things, all those ideas we had together and continue to in us? He was in the United States, I was in the United States, but we had touched each other's hearts. He had been to my home, he had been to my village, he had seen my people. Charles remains a household word, household name in Nigeria today, and in fact, in African literature as a whole. Charles, I say, farewell, Chuck. Rest in peace.
Thank you, Mr. Emenyohan. I'm going to move on now to James Gibbs, and I ask everyone to try to keep the comments between 3 to 5 minutes. I know we have a lot to say about our beloved friend, but James Gibbs, are you out there?
Thank you, David. Thank you for setting this up, and thank you for having me. I wanted to tell a little of my story because it reflects the importance of Chuck's pioneering work in the field of African literature, the way that he made it a study without frontiers. I graduated from Bristol University in 1965. I had a broad-based arts degree that included studies in English literature and drama. In the fall of 1965, I drew a bow at a venture by registering for an MA at American University. I started studying international relations, but I soon found that I was out of my depth, and I changed my major to African area studies. When the time came to choose a thesis topic and subjects for comprehensive exams, I was lucky to find that Chuck Larson was there and already establishing himself in the new field. With his help and supervision, I presented a thesis on Nigerian drama and submitted myself for examinations in African literature. In all this, I was aware that Chuck was getting a lot of support from colleagues such as Dr. Absalom Vilakazi. And in my work on African literature, I was tremendously encouraged by the librarians at American University. What was said earlier about Chuck and the school library may feed in here, because it was wonderful to find enthusiastic librarians making sure that books were ordered and that subscriptions were paid. In 1968, having been recruited by voluntary service overseas, which is perhaps a bit like the UK's Peace Corps, I took up an instructor level post in the English department at the University of Ghana. And although there were individual Ghanaian academics who were playing roles in midwifing African writing, the English department had not responded to the challenge thrown down by independence. Indeed, the syllabus stuck firmly with British writers. Even Ivy Compton Burnett was still on the syllabus. However, partly because Chuck had made a space within the academic structure at AU for the study of African literature, I was in a position to introduce African writing into my teaching. Many years later, one of my students from that time, Abu Shado Abari, told me that a first year session I had devoted to a passage from Aikwe Ama's Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born was the first time he had encountered a text by an African author in the classroom. The thesis Chuck supervised on Nigerian dramatists stood me in good stead when it came to sourcing African material for theatre groups, particularly the Legon 7 that I founded in Ghana. One of the programs I put together, The Trial of Wole Soyinka, drew on extracts from works by the Nigerian playwright and novelist who we have heard contributes to the funeral tributes. It employed the conceit that the playwright had started a drama group in the prison where he was being held. It got a thumbs down from Abiola Ireli at a campus publication, but freed from detention, Soyinka said he liked the script. Important for me was the fact that the copy I had sent to Chuck prompted him to write up the whole story for the nation and give us some international attention. Let's fast forward to the 1970s when I was teaching in the University of Malawi and Chuck and Roberta were able to visit. At Chancellor College, they told the students something of the work they were engaged with. In Chuck's case, it was apparent that his concern with the new and the different was driving him to engage with a wide range of new literatures. He was continuing to open doors and cross frontiers, to innovate and break new ground. Roberta, meanwhile, had much of relevance to say to students in a country where the reactionary head of state, Hastings Banda, made it illegal for women to wear trousers. It was good to meet Chuck and Roberta in a different place. And in Malawi, it was good to reflect on Chuck's innovative work at AU. The kind of revolution he had started had ripples which spread throughout the continents. The University of Malawi, influenced by Ngugi and Professor James Stewart, Adrian Roscoe and Jack Mapanji, had refocused the literature syllabus so that it no longer started with Shakespeare, but now began with the study of oral traditions. By making this shift, the university was responding to the process of decolonization and to the study of African creativity that Chuck had campaigned for. The steps taken in Malawi did not mean that all the shadows had been put to flight. There were many remaining problems, including the Malawian censorship board. But there had been some positive changes, and Chuck had been on the side of those changes. He had championed an idea whose time had come. He had been on the side of history and introduced changes that many have benefited from, including me. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, which is Helon Habila.
First of all, my condolences to Chuck's family, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this event today. It's been inspiring to hear all the memories people are sharing about Chuck. I'm going to read briefly from what I've written. The first time I met Charles Larson was sometime in 2008, 1 year after I had moved to the US from the UK. We were on a panel to discuss African literature and politics at the American University. After the event, I went over to Larson to introduce myself formally. But to my surprise, he told me that this wasn't our first meeting. We had met earlier in 2003, he reminded me. at an event organized by the Kane Prize. He was right. It all came back to me. That day, in 2003, we had had a laugh when I asked him what he thought about Ayikwe Ama's charge of larceny against him. I was impressed that Charles saw the humor in it. And to me, that is one thing that distinguishes generational literary critics from ours. They were willing to take swings at each other in the name of literature and to laugh afterwards. They were able to compartmentalize, whether it was Soyinka accusing the Negritude poets of neo-Tarzanism, or Chinwezu accusing Soyinka of deliberate obscurantism in style. Bole Kaja criticism, Chinwezu called it. Calm down, let's fight. Disagreements and literary fights led to replies and reposts, and that is how criticism gives birth to more criticism. That is why that generation of writers were also all literary critics. People like Charles Larson, through their writings, forced the generation of African writers to dig deeper, to think critically. And that ultimately resulted not just in better creative work, but in more thoughtful critical writing. The second time I met Charles Larson, which is technically the third time, I was giving a talk at the Library of Congress, and there was Mr. Larson in the audience. I had no idea he was going to be there. In my prepared speech, I had referenced a few passages from his seminal book, The Emergence of African Fiction. And as I read my speech, I couldn't help but keep glancing at him nervously, wary of misrepresenting him, but he kept nodding his head encouragingly, putting me at ease. That's how my friendship with Charles, or Chuck, as he insisted on being called, began. He would occasionally send me an email and we would arrange to meet, sometimes in a bookstore, sometimes at Union Station, and we would spend an hour or two discussing new African writing and writers. When my book, Oil and Water, came out, he reviewed it and we met to discuss the book and the situation in the Niger Delta. He was remarkably well-informed, better informed than I was, I must admit, about the younger writers whom he sometimes reviewed in his Counterpunch column. I remember one meeting which we dedicated to discussing Achebe's new book, There Was a Country, and another meeting we discussed Ghana Must Go by Tijan Sallah. But books weren't the only things we discussed. At one meeting, I remember, we talked about coffee. I can't remember what started the conversation, but we must have spent almost 30 minutes talking about coffee, the merits of taking it black or with cream, and comparing coffee to tea, and the colonial influence that led to tea drinking in most post-colonial countries. That led naturally to a discussion of the Boston Tea Party. Needless to say, I left that meeting well-informed about the political import of tea and coffee drinking. But that's how it was with Chuck. He was easy to talk to, a good listener, and you could talk to him about almost any subject and he would listen with all seriousness, and you didn't feel as if you had to impress him. The last time I met Chuck was in 2019 at Georgetown University. Wole Soyinka was given a reading alongside a drama production. After the meeting, we all posed for a picture, Soyinka, Dr. Tijan Sallah, and Chuck. I told him about my new book, which had just come out. Well, send me a copy and I'll review it, he said. Though, he added, he couldn't promise. It all depended on his health. What about your health? I asked. He was receiving treatment for cancer, he told me. And when he saw the look on my face, he quickly assured me that the cancer was in remission, that he was going to be okay. As it turned out, he never got to review my book. As it turned out, that was the last time we were to meet. And how symbolically fitting that we met surrounded by writers at a literary event. I find it hard to believe that I will never again get one of those emails from him inviting me to meet at Union Station or at Politics and Prose bookstore to discuss African literature. Now I realize how important those meetings were. Apart from talking about books, Chuck was also looking out for me, making sure I was okay, encouraging me to keep writing. After all, I was a new immigrant to America, trying to raise a family and be a writer and a teacher. He never asked me if I was okay directly, but I know now that was part of what he was doing. Thank you.
We'll go on to Marita Golden.
Only the thing for which you have struggled will last. Yoruba proverb. Professor Charles Larson taught me many things. When we met, I was a Black, proud, loud, with an insatiable curiosity about the world and an intense desire to change the world. I was a writer whose voice was gestating, not yet full blown. I was addicted to reading and loved stories as much as I loved life. While enrolled in several of Chuck's African literature courses at American University, our relationship grew, it seemed, with lightning speed, from student teacher to student mentor. And in the years that followed, we became friends and colleagues in the odyssey that is African and African-American literature. Our friendship lasted 50 years. That's how it was with Chuck. If you were lucky enough to know him and to be respected by him, you were gratefully stuck with him. Chuck was so alive and curious, unabashedly eager about everything, especially people. As a young Black student at American University, it meant everything, and I mean everything, to bask in the glow of Chuck's sincere interest in me. I love that this relatively young white guy, only 12 years older than me, had served in the Peace Corps in Nigeria, and while there fell in love with the people and their literal and figurative stories. Chuck was one of several white male teachers, not dead white males, but truly alive white males that saw me, heard me, and empowered me during my time at American University. There was Frank Turage, Charles McLaughlin, Charles Hardwick. I loved my time at AU from 68 to 72 so much that I got depressed when I thought about graduating. Chuck's classes taught me that the real story of a people is not in the history books, but in their novels and poems, which are manifestations and expressions of their dreams, their fantasies and deepest yearnings. I wasn't just reading Achebe and Shoyinka. In Chuck's classes, I witnessed these masters being rendered up into my eager sophomore mind by someone who was a true believer in the sanctity and value of these stories and how those stories bound us all to one another. I had no idea sitting in his classes that one day I would teach literature and writing. But years later, when I found myself looking out at my students' faces, I reflexively called up memories of the rigor and enthusiasm that reigned in those classrooms with Chuck. Under his wise tutelage, we were reading work that required us to think in new ways and to write about what we had read with clarity and depth. Chuck gave us everything in those lectures, making each one an adventure, and it always felt as if he was rediscovering anew a text that he'd read dozens of times. When I became a teacher, he was my model. If I wasn't passionate about the subject, why should my students stay away? If I didn't push them towards excellence, I was a failure and a fraud. Chuck's life motto was clearly, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste," which led him to become one of the earliest and most influential interpreters of African literature to audiences that were both suddenly available and that he helped create. There were no borders, no boundaries to a sense of the significance of the literature diasporic peoples had created. He was perennially creative and productive in his work as critic and scholar. I learned how to listen from Chuck. Behind his glasses, his eyes would lock into yours and you knew you were being heard. He was a godfather to so many of us. And like all godfathers and godmothers, he knew that in a world that seemed to offer a lifetime subscription to self-doubt, anxiety, and fear, that there's honor and incredible grace in cheering someone on, in believing in someone when, or even because they could not quite believe in themselves. Thank you, Chuck, for teaching me how to tell my story, and for showing me how to help others tell theirs. Mostly thank you, Chuck, for showing me how to live. After all, isn't that really the greatest story ever told?
we have, so many of us have had that experience of being stuck with Chuck 50 years. That's a beautiful story. And Helon, the story of him looking back at you from the audience and nodding is just so touching to me, because I've had that experience myself. Thank you all. Bernd Lindfors.
Chuck and I resemble one another quite a lot in the way we came into studies of Africa. He went to Nigeria for 2 years. I went to Kenya for 2 years in a similar program, not the Peace Corps, but something in East Africa. And we both came back with the ambition to study the literature we started reading while teaching. And he found an opportunity to do that in the comparative literature program at Indiana University. I found an opportunity in the English department at the University of California, Los Angeles. Both campuses had extensive African studies curricula, and it was possible to tune into courses and take advantage of the rather vast libraries both campuses had. And we both produced dissertations on African literature, which were unusual in those days. Chuck also, while he was at Indiana, was one of the first Americans to start teaching courses in African literature. And he continued that when he moved to Washington and joined you at American University. Actually, his interest, though very deep in African literature right from the start, was also quite broad-minded. He had mentioned to me that when he did his BA and MA at the University of Colorado, he never read a book by a minority author. Yet, when he started his work at Indiana, he not only looked at African literature in depth, but he also became editor of a series for the Collier, what's it called? The Collier African American Library, which brought back into circulation books that had gone out of print, not only from Africa, but from African America, from the Caribbean, and produced about 40 books, which indicated the broad-mindedness he had about the field he was entering in, even though he had no training in some of those areas. And the teaching he did by bringing those texts back into circulation enabled many of us who are starting out in this field actually to have texts that we could teach. I remember especially having available Peter Abrams' Erythrodomo, Mungo Betty's Mission to Kala, which were printed initially in his series. So he made a big contribution right away in broadening the curriculum that American students had access to. And this was reflected in his scholarship too, which was quite remarkable because although he started as an Africanist, he went well beyond Africa, publishing a second book on the novel in the Third World, which was building on what he was reading, and then went on also to become an expert in African American literature, and also in American Indian literature. There was this expansiveness to his view of what literature should be. It should be an international, inter-ethnic enterprise. And he pursued this in his scholarship and his teaching to great advantage. So I envied him having the time and ability to devote so much attention to areas that he had not been trained in. He was really a self-taught scholar, but he brought a wealth of knowledge from what he read and what he experienced. So I'm very glad to have had a colleague like that my entire career, because we enjoyed getting together at conferences and other times when I visited Washington. And he was always a friend and a great conversationalist. Thank you.
Ethelbert Miller.
When I remember Charles Larson, I think about the first time I stuck my head into his office like a young Marco Polo. I didn't know him or his work. I was usually on the campus of American University visiting my fellow poets, Myra Scleroux and Henry Taylor, who worked there. I admired Myra for her Mother Teresa kindness and generosity. I often thought about climbing into one of her poems just to be held close to her. Henry was a person I was simply in awe of. How many poems had this man memorized over the years? He'd won the Pulitzer Prize around the time we met. I knew Myra and Henry better than I knew Charles. I also knew African-American literature better than I knew African literature. Looking back on my career as a writer and literary activist, I realized that until I met Charles Larson and Donald Hurdick, the founder and owner of Three Continents Press, my knowledge of African literature was limited maybe to Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe and The Poem Wine Drinker by Amos Tutuola. Both books were required reading for a humanities course I must have taken around 1969 at Howard University. It often resulted in me often using the expression, things fall apart after a failed love relationship, and my long desire to taste palm wine, which when I finally tasted, I didn't like. In 1997, Charles Larson edited Under African Skies, Modern African Stories. It's the only autographed book I have of his. He signed it for Ethelbert, one of the best, Chuck. It's something that still humbles me almost 25 years later. In his introduction to Under African Skies, Larson mentions a few things that should be underscored, highlighted, and not forgotten. Larson was able to recognize the resiliency of African literature. He saw, despite obstacles, that African literature was moving to center stage. He knew that some of the African writers had to overcome censorship, exile, and even the high illiteracy among the people he or she wanted to reach in order to be published and read. Larson was a witness to the emergence of African women writers. The delay in their presence in the field, a result of women not having access to education. He saw happily that the situation had changed in the last few years. The literary silence for African women has come to an abrupt end. The work accomplished by Charles John Larson was not just that of discovery, it was visionary in regards to what he wanted to build. Larson established the African Skies Library Foundation. He saw a need for free public libraries in Africa. He saw these libraries as serving as centers for adult literacy education, computer training, and helping to promote health education. In the brochure he circulated trying to obtain support for his project, he mentioned that libraries in Africa were limited to urban areas associated with universities and public schools. Many Africans had never used a library. Many had never even seen one. Larson was an advocate of mobile libraries, even while realizing that in rural areas, transportation was a problem. He saw the use of book carts as a possible solution. One way of remembering Charles Larson is to view his life and work as a bridge between people and continents, a bridge consisting of words and languages, a bridge bringing the past into the future. Larson was a man who dreamed the world we now live in. The sky above is beautiful, and the stories told below have become the harvest we give thanks for. And we thank Charles Larson for the rain, the sun, and all the goodness he provided when he told us to look to Africa, to read what was written, and to remember to always honor the tradition from where it comes.
Veronique Taggio.
I'm in the audience, thank you. And I would like first to pass on my condolences to Charles Larson's family and friends and colleagues. I am probably the person who knew him the least, but he left a very, very strong impression on my mind. I saw him as somebody who fell in love with African literature and never turned back. I think that his vision of African literature was very Pan-African, in the sense that he immediately went to Francophone literature as well. He could have just focused on Anglophone literature, but he also went to French, literature, African literature written in the French language. And I met him at some conferences, but we started writing when he was editing his book Under African Skies. And it was very comforting for me to see that someone that I was not aware of at the time had kind of taken notice of what I was writing in French, and had asked me to contribute to this wonderful book Under African Skies. And I think that it changed my perception also of where I fitted in. And suddenly being among other African writers from the Anglophone side and also the Lusophone side, I really felt like I was part of a family, and that I was part of, that there was a conversation going on. And I think I owe that to him in part. The second time we really started talking again, more at length, was when he wrote his book on the plight of the African writer. And I must say that I was really struck by his courage, because that was some sort of a kind of, how could you say that, a family secret, in the sense that a lot of writers were unhappy with the relationship they had with their publishers on the continent. But that was not said. So I thought that it took extreme courage from a person like him to deal with a subject like that. Basically, he asked me to tell him how I was evolving as a writer in connection with publishers on the Francophone side. It was a difficult time, I must say. There were a lot of things that were not right, in the sense that, for example, copyrights were not something that had any kind of sense in the way that you were supposed as a writer to be happy to be published and not really expect copyright. I think that his position was that in order to have a vibrant African literature, African writers needed to be in the most favorable conditions. And that could only happen if there was a good relationship between writers and publishers. And I'm really glad that he wasn't focusing on publishers in the West, but on publishers on the continent, because it's my belief as well that you will have a vibrant African literature if it also comes from African publishers, if the drive comes from the continent. Otherwise, there's always going to be that disconnection between what is written abroad and what is written on the continent. And luckily, things have evolved. But I think that is without doubt, you can say that by taking the bull by the horn, Charles Larson, also helps to kind of make a better context in terms of writing. And I really had a lot of time for him. And he struck me as someone who believed in what he said. And African literature wasn't a hobby for him. It was a real passion. So today, as I said, we have more writers, African writers, who are happy with their situation. African publishing is developing very well, and you have a lot of writers who are published in the West, who make sure that they are also published on the continent. So all in all, I think that this explains why you have so much talent coming from the continent at the moment. But you needed people like Charles Larson to also give a push when it was necessary. So in that sense, he will be missed a lot. And I enjoyed the times I had the opportunity to be in contact with him.
Thank you, Veronique. And we have Henry Taylor.
It's nice to meet you, David.
And you as well.
And I want to say hi to all my old friends who are on the panel across the top of the screen here. It's wonderful to see you and to meet new people and sort of new people. I met Veronique Tajo in May of 1987 in Paris under the auspices of a magazine called La Tradutière and its editor, Jacques Rancourt. It's wonderful to see you again after all that time. The light that Chuck shed on African literature bids fair to stay bright for a long time to come. Clearly, his labors in that specialty can legitimately be called his life's work. But I'm grateful as well for his several forays in noticeably different directions. 3 novels, one of them, The Insect Colony, admittedly set in Africa, but exploring the topic of white exploitation of African culture. Another, Arthur Dimmesdale, a profound and witty retelling of the Scarlet Letter. Academia Nuts is in a category of its own, being a satire that may at first appear to skewer a fictional student and her writing, but which mercilessly demonstrates how teaching can go wrong. As a colleague, he maintained a delicate and beautifully useful balance between satirical hilarity and the deepest wisdom. Toward the end of my time at American University, my wife Mush and I spent quite a few evenings with Chuck and Roberta in their home and in ours, and both of us treasure our recollections of the good-humored camaraderie and warm affection of those times. Chuck was that rare and valuable being, a funny man of very deep seriousness. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. We actually met in 1991. I approached you at AWP as a fan.
Oh, thank you.
It's
nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again. And our final guest among the contributors is Oki Ndibe.
Oh my gosh, it's been such a rich harvest to just listen to everybody who has spoken so wonderfully about a man who was capacious in his taste, in his passion for African literature, and a man who bucked a certain trend amongst some of his colleagues who had a narrow focus in their study of African literature. I was quite surprised when Chuck, and by the way, I'd like to give my greetings to Roberta, to the rest of the family on the passing of this truly remarkable man. So I was quite pleasantly surprised when Chuck reviewed my second novel, Foreign Gods, Inc. in 2014. And so I sought out his email address and I wrote him an email saying thank you. And he wrote me back and said, okay, I really loved your book. I really love your book. And he said, I'll be there at Politics and Prose, where I had a reading coming up. I didn't believe it, but here he was. And then he sprung another surprise on me, because this is a man who's been so consequential in the conversation around African literature for a few decades. I've been aware of his reputation as a young journalist back in Nigeria. And so when I walked in, I literally expected to see a giant, a physical giant. But here was this intellectual giant coming in a rather modest frame, physical frame. But then the smile and those eyes, as we greeted and shook hands. I believe he'd come there with my friend Tijan Sallah, who drew my attention as soon as I entered the bookstore and said, here is Chuck Larson. Oh my gosh, it was such a special experience. And he'd offered to take me out to go have coffee. And so I would have had perhaps the kind of education that my friend Helon Habila had on coffee and such matters. But unfortunately, some other friends had made arrangements for a reception for me where so that I couldn't accept his invitation. And then a few years later, again, I was stunned to that he read and loved and reviewed my memoir, Never Look an American in the Eye. It's one of those sad losses, I will say, that somebody who was so warm, so passionate, so greedy to do good, greedy for friendship, that he and I didn't have more than a passing relationship. But the few times that I met him, because I came again to DC to read from my memoir, and there he was again, just as Helon said, nodding in a very encouraging way as I spoke and read from my book. So just two things that I'd like to say just off the cuff about this man, that there was a fearlessness about the man, because he did make statements about African literature that invited sometimes very venomous pushback from some writers. And, that's part of the Larson reputation. But then his breadth, his greatness as a human was in the fact that he continued to speak, and that in his books, he was not afraid to indicate that he'd revised some of his positions and that he'd been perhaps wrong in a few things. It takes true greatness for somebody to have that kind of both fearlessness and that kind of curiosity and passion for literature and for a people. So it's Chuck is no longer physically with us, but the work he did is going to last for a long time. And one more thing, just the investment that he made in reviewing new African writers who otherwise would not perhaps get noticed was truly, for me, admirable. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this conversation and this remembrance of Chuck.
Thank you, Oki. And it's so nice to hear with such consistency the same message of meetings with Chuck, where we have this feeling, here is Chuck Larson, and the feeling of meeting a giant of a person. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I wanted to just read for you all, and remember that you can get a copy if you send Roberta an envelope. But I wanted to read the words of Shoenka, which open this this collection, remembering Charles R. Larson. urbane in all circumstances in which we interacted, unflappable. He at least understood that while writers and critics serve the same muse, they mostly interact closer to the clashing rocks of Scylla and Charybdis. As long as literature continued to emerge unscathed, despite such risk-laden rites of passage, Charles Larson remained content with his role as expositor. He pursued his partnership in that mission with intellectual ease, and he certainly needed such virtues in relating to an immediate post-colonial generation. That was one season of feisty, culture-assertive, and independent-minded writers, impatient with any signs of imperial imposition or condescension. At the base of it all, a human warmth, compassionate, genuine friendship. Far too often, one fervently wished there were just a few more in the Charles Larson mold. Thank you all. Thank you, to you all contributors. And I want to open it up now to the gallery. I know that there are lots of folks in the AU crowd who would like to contribute as well, and friends of Chuck and Roberta's. So could we do it this way? Could you just put your hand up if you don't know how to use the function at the bottom, which is reactions. Under reactions, you can actually put a hand up. But if you are not comfortable with that, I see John Hyman. So John, would you unmute?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Thank you, David, for putting this together. This has been sort of a combination of inspiring and humbling all at once. When I think of Chuck, I have hundreds of memories. And I realized that some of them sort themselves into things that happened while he and I were walking. About 20 years ago, he and I were walking in a shopping district in the United Arab Emirates, of all places. We had been told that the expectation for the shopkeepers was that we should negotiate prices. I'm sure you can all imagine the delight that Chuck demonstrated in haggling over every last dirham. I can still hear him cackling as if he'd won. But I also remember the many walks we would take almost daily in the morning from our offices in Battelle Hall over to one of the dormitories to pick up our copy of the New York Times. And mostly on those walks, we would, talk about gossip, office news, the weather, gardening. But just as often, we would find ourselves talking about health and family. Josh and Vanessa, it won't surprise you that we often were talking about you, and I spoke of my children. And when the conversation had turned serious, Chuck, it was almost tacit, but he
John, I think we've lost sound for you.
heard it. One day, Chuck and I were walking to do an errand down at the AU offices on New Mexico Avenue by Chef Jeff's. It was August. It was about 100 degrees outside. And as we began our return up the hill, Chuck noticed that a dog had been leashed to the outdoor railing. It was panting. Saying nothing, he detoured instantly into what was Balducci's. I could see through the glass window that he was having an energetic conversation with the folks inside. They probably didn't know Chuck as well as I. They knew, I knew, of course, he wasn't going to take no for an answer.
John, we lost sound for you. I think John's camera has frozen.
As he began slobbering into that relieving water. That was Chuck. He was wise. He was occasionally silly, but always he was kind. And I think of him all the time. I'm sorry, I'm done.
Thank you, John. We can all translate that into our own version of Chuck reaching out and asserting in that way that was his alone. It was beautiful. Who else would like to speak? Jeff.
Hi, thanks. I'm just a AU alum, class of 2008, and I can be pretty brief. To quickly describe how I met Professor Larson, it was I signed up for Third World Literature because it met after 12 p.m. mostly, all the best reasons. I think it was after like the 4th week of class or something like that. We read an excerpt from the Palm Wine Drinkard, and I spoke with him about it after class, and he encouraged me to read the whole novel. And he lent me his copy that he had up at the podium with him. And he said, but be a little careful, please. It's a first edition. So that was the worst weekend of my life, trying to desperately to read this first edition Palm Wine Drinkard from 1952 without damaging it. But that was his enthusiasm for anyone who was enthusiastic and his generosity. After that, my first semester as a full-time college student, as soon as I finished my last exam, my first week of my winter vacation, I read one of his novels, The Insect Colony, his book, The Emergence of African Fiction, and another novel that he recommended to me. And that's not something I did for any other professors in college or law school, just to get a sense of the impact that class had on me. I also took a class with him all 5 semesters that I was at American University. My graduation party was going out to dinner with Professor Larson and my family and nobody else. And he was a very, very important friend to me for all of the time since I graduated in 2008. It was a very special relationship for me, and I might have guessed that that there were so many people out there, and it's been so special to hear from some of them today that had this same experience of just having this person who was a beautiful friend, a beautiful mentor, advocate, career counselor, life therapist, all in one, so generous with his time. And the idea that he would do this for me, even as he was corresponding with some of the greatest writers on the planet Earth, is just remarkable to me. And it's something that I just hope that I can, the rest of my life, I'll just be looking for opportunities to sort of pay this forward and emulate this, this extreme generosity that he showed me.
Thanks, Jeff. And I see Courtney and David.
Yes. My wife, Courtney, and I were Peace Corps volunteers in Ethiopia a little bit after Chuck was in Nigeria. And we recognize that most of you are in the academic community. What I wanted to be able to express to you is that Chuck, as impatient as he could be with people, was very tolerant of me as a journalist. When in 1995, while I was editing a magazine coincidentally called Worldview, which went to many of the 250,000 returned Peace Corps volunteers in America, Chuck suggested to me when we met that he needed to do what he wanted to do. He became the book reviews and fiction editor of Worldview magazine. And for 11 years, that's 44 issues of the magazine, he was in charge of that part of it. And he was very patient with me about all of my efforts to produce the magazine with his material in it, which included not only Africans and some of the names of people who've heard today, Ernest, Veronique, Tijan, also many writers in the Middle East, Hanan al-Sheikh, and Nuruddin Farah from Somalia, and Mina Nayak. So he was able to, through this magazine, to a very somewhat less academic public, do the same thing he was trying to do with all of the rest of his efforts in his life. And I really valued those 11 years that he worked with me. And I really want to express our honor in being able to be present here to learn the incredible things about Chuck that we never knew in his career. And to thank Roberta and Vanessa, who, because he was such a proud father, made sure that she began corresponding for the magazine when she went to Istanbul. So this is another aspect of Chuck that I hope you all realize.
Thank you, David. We have Marianne Noble and then Jeff Middens. Why don't we just go one after the other?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I wrote this down, and I'm echoing things that so many people have said, and I felt like maybe it was uniquely mine, but I felt like Chuck had a way of appreciating who people were rather than focusing on who they weren't. In all my anxious years as a junior professor, Chuck never made me feel that I was lacking anything. To the contrary, he seemed to value me as a unique individual, and I really felt that he wanted the best for everyone around him. I really think of Chuck as a great listener. When I think of what I love most about him, I picture myself in the family room in his and Roberta's house, a small tray of cheese and olives on the ottoman, a big glass of vodka in his hand, and Chuck leaning forward to give me his undivided attention. It seemed like whatever I had to say was of great interest to him, and I really loved that feeling. I felt like he was always interested in art, in ideas, and really encouraging people. It's like he was interested in what people all around the world had to say, and he wanted to encourage them to say it as well as they possibly could. He encouraged everyone, promoted everyone, listened to them, and nurtured them. He believed in the power of art to change the world, to make the world more humane and reasonable. He was truly a great friend and colleague. That's it.
Marianne. That's lovely. Thank you, Marianne. And we can all agree, those of us who worked with him and who knew him in that way. Jeff?
Hi, everyone. I can echo so many of the stories that have been told. And I'll throw this one out to throw a contemporary spin on this. I currently teach a class called Literature, Film, and Globalization. And this week, among other things, my class read a short story by someone named Carmen Naranjo, a short story called And We Sold the Rain. And as the class was about to begin, and this was literally 2 days ago, they stopped me before we began and said, Professor, the PDF that you've given us has these other 2 names on it that were the editors of this particular collection, which is Worlds of Fiction, which is edited by Roberta Rubenstein and Charles Larson. And they said, do you know anything about them? So let's just say that my class started later than it would have, because it allowed for an opportunity to bring to students today this memory, knowing that we were having this gathering today. And in terms of bringing to the students of today some of the love and the magic that Chuck and Roberta that have brought us. We miss you, Chuck.
Thank you, Jeff. I don't see any more reaction hands Matt.
Thank you, David. I do want to say one thing because I have a different perspective in a way. I wasn't born during Charles Larson's time in the Peace Corps. I was not his student, and I don't have the advantage of being a colleague among you in literature and academia. But I knew him because I'm a staff person here at American University for the last 25 years. And our relationship started with a rather inauspicious start. It was my first day as the textbook manager of the campus bookstore when I was informed that there were 2 angry faculty members in the aisles and we were selling the wrong book for their class. Well, the faculty members turned out to be Chuck and Roberta. And the book that we weren't selling was Worlds of Fiction, their book. My predecessor had ordered something else, and I was cheerfully selling the wrong book to their students. But it was shortly resolved, and they were they were kind about it and understanding, and we took care of it. And then when a couple of years later, I moved to the dean's office, I had much more opportunity to work with both, and particularly Chuck in his time when he was chair. It falls on staff members to be the person who always throw up an obstacle to something that needs doing, or to say no. And that was definitely the case for my job. And yet he always took it in good cheer and reasonably. And I can tell you, he always fought for his faculty and his students, for those best classrooms, for all the things that we tried to say he couldn't do, he would try to get done for you. But most important to me, he was always kind and respectful and treated all staff with the collegiality, you know, as equals. And I was really touched by that. And I just want to end with one last anecdote. After those period, one of his last years on campus, I ran into him in the hallway. He asked how I was doing, and I had confessed that I was thinking about going back to graduate school in a different field than literature. But I was thinking of going back and having my doubts because I was already well into middle age. I said, I just don't know if it's worth it. I don't know if anyone can make a career in academia with the late start that I would get. I certainly couldn't go for tenure because who would hire somebody like me? And he said, oh, well, I don't know. From a chair's perspective, it might be very nice to hire someone like you into a tenure slot, because if you turned out to be a terrible choice, it would be very comforting to know you'd soon retire. So when I think of Chuck Larson, I think of that humor and that spirit and that kindness, and I always will. And I extend that to Roberta as well, who I worked with so frequently. And so I didn't want to miss this opportunity to share my love and to thank you for letting me be a part of your lives just a little bit.
Thank you, Matt. And Anne Farron.
I was glad to hear the reference to third world literature by a student in 2008, because back in 1986, American University was revising its general education program. We were very far ahead of things and wanted to include a requirement in the international area, but we did not want to have just courses from the School of International Service. So I went to see Chuck because I had heard about his African literature and asked if he would be willing to add a course to the curriculum. He had only been able to teach it maybe every third year to graduate students and taught it often enough to keep it from being dropped from the curriculum. So he was reluctant, but said, well, he would try it. He wasn't sure whether undergraduates would be interested. We'd see. So we didn't put a lid on it, and about 60 students showed up for the very first class. He was a little bit startled. I went to visit the class, but he taught it just the way he had done it with the graduate students, as though it was a small class seminar. And he would walk around the class just asking questions. What do you think the author was trying to say? Who did you identify with in this story? And it was just an amazing experience to see him realize that the students loved this literature, which they had not had access to before. So I've always been grateful that he was willing, and to see that the course is still being taught so many years later to undergraduates is really a thrill.
Thank you, Anne. And Jonathan Abadi.
Well, I had not intended on saying anything. I intended to come and listen, but I guess I feel inspired to say something. I guess Chuck is changing the weather during the course of this memorial service, and also continuing to inspire all of us. And maybe the unique thing about my experience with Chuck is that I was his student more than 40 years ago. And there was a 40-year gap between my time with Professor Larson and my most recent encounter with him. And I would say that he's just so beautifully captured by everything that everyone has said here today. We all have our own individual experiences with him, but they all seem to resonate with some very similar themes. His sense of humor, his sense of compassion, and his depth as a thinker and as a person. Those were all evident to me 40 years ago. And I would say that he made such an impact on me. And I think when I think about it, the impact was, you know, being invited into the world of ideas and of activism and of culture and of politics and writing, being invited into it by him in a very gentle and playful way, and also being at the same time pushed out into the world by him, being challenged by him, but also in a very gentle and playful way. He was so full of energy and he was so engaged as a professor, you couldn't help but to be drawn in and to be excited. And I guess as a professor, what more can you ask for but to have that kind of impact on students? And he had that impact, from what I can tell, on hundreds, if not thousands of students. And so I can say with total honesty that he was a formative figure in my life and had a huge impact. And then there was this long 40-year gap. Hadn't seen him. I had been in very intermittent and frequent contact with Roberta. I ended up bringing my daughter through American University for her to look at it as a potential school. And Chuck and Roberta, Chuck in an act of total generosity came out and spent more than an hour with me and my daughter. And what I was struck with was the guy hadn't really changed that much at all. I mean, if anything, he had more energy. He was so engaged. I'm a civil rights lawyer and I'm very politically active. And Chuck, I never knew he was a writer for Counterpunch. And he was so on point and so alive and so full of energy. It was inspiring again. So there it was, the same experience 40 years later with the same person, this man who lived such a huge life and lived it up until the very end, because he was still so full of everything that I had experienced so long ago. So I just feel inspired by him. What a beautiful human being. What a gift he was to the world.
Thank you, Jonathan. What a lovely share that was. One of the things that rings in my ears right now and always is Chuck's voice. I would tell him about something that was happening in my life or my career, and he would just say, "This is great. This is great," and really mean it. And I hear it all the time. I hear that this is great. This is great. And that feeling of earnest, like happiness for the success of others. It's really one of his great skills. Well, thank you for that. And Rashida, there you are.
Hello?
Yes, hello.
Now you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's been a very wonderful and full afternoon, and I think we all have an interesting sense of Charles Larson. I wanted to share. We always met at conferences, mostly at ALA, and I certainly had my share of people who found me a bit opinionated and so forth. The thing that I guess I liked most about him was that he really was willing to understand that I didn't think, I had reservations about people teaching African literature. And namely, it was racial. I was concerned about white people in general. I'm not talking about specialists, I'm just in general, because racism is so international and so ingrained. And I didn't want patronage. I didn't want paternalism. I just wanted people to be able to conceive that an African could conceive of a novel that did not have to be compared to a white writer, that literature could stand on their own. And I appreciate the fact that he could hear my concern and not get defensive, and really, he tried very hard to read the literature on its own and to appreciate the writer on its own. And I don't think that that's an easy thing to do. He struggled to be a good human being, to be a fair person, and he was able to accept social constrictions that are on all of us and himself as well. And yes, he was opinionated too. And when he thought that I had said something that he didn't agree with, that I was accusing him, whether I was or not, he would let me know. And we could have a kind of back and forth without eviscerating either our person or our perspective. And that was really all that I was asking for. And I appreciate that. I hope that as we go forward, that we can really try to make a space in this world for all human beings and all voices. And that we can really tone down the competition and the comparisons. That my work doesn't have to be at the level of somebody else. It is at the level that it is. And yours doesn't have to be that way also. And I think he's a good model for all of that. And I want to thank his family, because to be a good professor like he was, to be a good listener, he had to have been reading a lot and really deeply reading. And that takes time. And sometimes that time is at the expense of one's family and one's friends. And that he still did it, and they supported and loved him through that whole process. I think that's a testimony to a good relationship. So I sincerely offer my appreciation to the family and to the friends who loved and nurtured him. And I hope that we'll try to be good human beings in this world with kindness, but also maintain our differences with respect for each other.
Roberta, would you like to say a few words? Yes. Would you like to say a few words, my friend?
It has just been unbelievable to hear everybody's comments. I'm just so moved. I have to say, in a way that Chuck himself would probably have said, I only wish he could have been here to enjoy this. I just want to close with one more anecdote. Some of you know that Chuck's extensive collection of African and African-American and other non-Western literature and writers, manuscripts and so on, were acquired by the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas. And at the opening of his archive, there was an interview by none other than Ben Lenfers, who just spoke earlier today. I had a DVD of it, which we watched. Vanessa and his husband Bryce are here from Denver, and Vanessa and her husband were here. And we all watched the first half. We're going to watch the second half tonight. But what I want to carry forward in this sort of closing moment is that a lot of the emphasis has legitimately been about how Chuck discovered his love of Africa and African literature and tried to bring that, really succeeded in bringing that into the United States and of course curricula and scholarship. But one of the comments he made at the Harry Ransom Center was that he learned as a teacher at a high school, a grammar school in Uruku, Nigeria, a very rural village, how much our Western idea of, quote, universality was challenged when you saw and when you taught literature from the West to people of a different culture. And at that time, the Nigerian school curriculum was entirely British because it was still, influenced by colonization. And the students had good English, but still couldn't understand a novel by Thomas Hardy. It wasn't their lack of English ability, it was their cultural difference that many of the experiences in the fiction, they had no context for. And so Chuck, as he was explaining and helping them to try to understand what was going on in the plot, really grasped that literature does have an important cultural context, and it has to be part of what people get when they read. So non-Western readers wouldn't necessarily immediately understand a Western novel, and it works the other way around too. We as Western readers fail to understand the full context of African literature, for example. And I think one of Chuck's many virtues as a teacher and scholar was to try to be a bridge in both directions, realizing that there wasn't really the kind of universality in the accepted Western sense, but that we have to be sensitive to the cultural particulars out of which literature grows. So I wanted to share that with you. I also just really want to thank all of you who are here as speakers, as audience, as people who cared about Chuck, and my friends and colleagues, all of you, and to thank David Keplinger for being such a marvelous moderator, and to thank Tijan Sallah, who was the inspiration in the first place, for, as you heard, for bringing these tributes into a booklet. And it was just a joyous, joyous celebration. Thank you all, more than I can say.
Thank you all. Well, that concludes our gathering, and just by looking at all the smiles on your faces, it feels like something wonderful has been shared. So thank you, and we'll close now. Bye-bye, everyone.